Friends, what are we going to do about the fact that there isn't enough research to support A, the existence of pathological demand avoidance, and B, evidence based strategies in order to support our pathologically demand avoidant children, teens, humans, and parents? So, often this is something that is wielded against parents who are wanting to experiment with a different paradigm or logic that is not based in behavioralism with their PDA children and teens, but rather based in the logic of their brain, their nervous system, and radically accepting it as a nervous system disability. So, I want to talk a little bit about the state of affairs and give you the good news or invitation to experiment with the recognition that we can still be rigorous, consistent, and use the scientific process within our homes, even if the peer reviewed journal articles and therefore the psychologists, doctors, and clinicians trained on that literature, which will be 20 years from now, still don't exist. Okay? So, most of the research that exists on PDA has come out of the UK and the PDA Society, and it's really wonderful, but it's primarily observational, meaning that they have collected data through surveys of parents of PDA adults. This is the same type of study I'm doing with the University of Michigan. It's a survey, it's observational, it's not randomized, it's not experimental, right? The people that we surveyed using my social media account is a biased sample, right? It's not going to capture observationally the whole picture, okay? We're at a very early stage in the research. The other body of literature, if you can even call it that, is meta-analyses of these limited observational studies that have been done that show they're not good enough studies and therefore PDA doesn't exist. So it's kind of tautological in the sense that it's just like going back and forth, okay? But this is how all research starts, with a question that we don't know the answer to and therefore have to collect data, run experiments, use a scientific process, and start to create a body or a canon of literature about it where there's debate, okay? But it's incipient, which means as a parent, it's super frustrating because you're being told, hey, these meta studies show that it doesn't exist because these observational studies aren't good enough and therefore your kid's not really PDA and we're going to use behavioral strategies. And that sucks, okay? Ideally, we would want to do experimental studies in order to understand truly whether or not taking a nervous system approach supports the well-being, basic needs access, connection, engagement, and mental health of our children. But that would require having two samples or two samples from a population that in distribution are equivalent, meaning like on average, these groups of children are similar and we can apply a treatment and a control and see if there are different outcomes. There's ethical issues with that. There's logistical and financial issues with that. Experimental studies are super expensive. Okay. So this is certainly not going to happen for a long time, I am sure. So where does this leave us? This leaves us with our small sample, which is our family. So even if you have 10 PDA kids, it's still a small sample. I only have one, so it's an N of one. And we can take more qualitative methods and the scientific process to determine through experimentation if things work for our family, okay? So this is the way, I believe, to introduce rigor, if that's your cup of tea, and track indicators and take a scientific approach to understanding what works for your family. So how does the scientific process work? work. So first, we usually, when we're developing a hypothesis about something, we often have a big body of literature to draw on, right? In our case with PDA, we don't have that big body of literature, but that's okay. We have logic, we can outline our assumptions, and we can also collect empirical data on our own child. We're never going to be able to do an experiment on our own child because it's an N of 1, okay? And we can develop a hypothesis from our own observations. What might that look like? That might look like I have used timeouts, I have used sticker charts, I have used positive discipline, I've used natural consequences, I've tried gentle parenting with strict boundaries. And my observation is that my kid went into burnout, they stopped eating or they stopped speaking, they had selective mutism, maybe they couldn't go to school anymore. And so we have this observation and some data points, right? And so we might develop a hypothesis, which is, you know what? Regardless of whether this says that PDA exists, what my data and my family tells me and my observation of my small sample of one or more is that I don't think these behavioral approaches work. So I'm going to hypothesize that it's not actually driven by behavior, whether or not we believe in PDA. So maybe we develop a hypothesis that supporting the nervous system and using accommodations would help our child, okay? But we can never refer back to the hypothesis unless we are consistent, apply a new strategy, and collect data. That's what an experiment is, right? It's an intervention. The cool thing about supporting your child's neurotype through nervous system-based accommodations, trust and connection approaches is that the intervention isn't going to be super traumatic. And you can always start your data collection and say, hey, this isn't working for us. My hypothesis was wrong. I'm pivoting. Great. Base it on your observations, right? So what we want to think about is a consistent period of time. So for example, our signature program, the Paradigm Shift program, is designed for a 3-month intensive process, meaning parents experiment consistently through a new logic with a new hypothesis. Instead of it being my child's behavior is motivated, I need to teach them in the moment, they're doing this on purpose, they have conscious control of the behavior, rather we develop the hypothesis that, ooh, this is a subconscious nervous system response they do not have control over. And therefore, our intervention is going to be supporting the nervous system and accommodating so that they can not spend so much time here in the survival brain, right? And then we start to apply accommodations and see along 3 dependent outcomes whether things improve, okay? So for most of the evidence-based studies on things like applied behavioral therapy that are often touted as the only evidence base that we have, especially for autistic children, they're measuring outcomes that aren't long-term enough and aren't necessarily what we care about as parents, which is, I care if my child's eating. I care if he's having like 2-hour panic attacks every day, even if he complied in therapy or at school. I care about his mental health when he's 20, not just when he's 5, right? So one of the things we can start tracking, and this is what I teach parents to do, is along 3 dimensions. One is nervous system activation. So we're actually measuring how intense, how frequent, how long do nervous system activation moments last? Like, how long are the meltdowns? How intense are they? Are things getting thrown? Are people getting hurt? And how frequently? And we want to see that go down, right? Because sometimes with the logic of behavioralism, we can see increased compliance that the studies capture within the setting of a clinical space. Like, yes, the child complied, but it's not externally valid. It's not an externally valid measure where it's the same outside of the clinical space, where the kid comes home and collapses, has shut down, stops talking, or can't eat or sleep. Okay, so we measure nervous system activation. Then we measure access to basic needs, meaning, is my child, as I apply this new logic with this hypothesis and implementing this different intervention, which is trauma-informed strategies that support your child's trust, felt safety, and connection, then we see, are they eating more? Are they needing less help with toileting? Are they having less trouble with things like encopresis, constipation, UTIs, stomach aches, diarrhea, etc.? Are they sleeping better or more? Are they able to engage in hygiene, like teeth brushing or showering? And how is safety, which might include things like self-harm, okay? So those are two dependent outcomes. And then the third is connection and engagement to you, which is going to look different than neurotypically conditioned things like speaking in a reciprocal way. Like if I say something to you, then you have to respond in a certain way, which might be something we're doing in a behavioral approach, which is more skills training and training a specific dependent outcome. But rather, we want to see organic connection, like your child giving you a gift or your teen coming out of their room for the first time in months and sitting next to you voluntarily in a room, even if they're not speaking. Okay, so we can look for these indicators that if you're a parent that doesn't care about those indicators, like feel free to ignore this presentation. But for me, when my son was in burnout and when my PDA son couldn't eat, was selectively mute, was sort of like a feral animal, I did not care what his compliance was in a therapy setting. What I cared about was his nervous system well-being, his basic needs, and his engagement and connection to the world, even if it was in a non-neurotypical way. So we can still use logic and rigor and the scientific process, even if what's been produced out of academia has not yet caught up to our lived reality. And as someone who has a doctorate in the social sciences and loves research, I deeply understand how long this takes, right? And it takes even longer once things are published and debated and peer reviewed and argued upon to agree upon something that can then be used to train the clinicians that are diagnosing our kids or giving us advice. So this is just to peel the veil off a little bit on what it means when someone says, this isn't evidence-based or PDA doesn't exist. It does exist. It just hasn't been studied yet, and it hasn't shifted quite the way that we think about things. And that's okay, because the reality in your home is a truth that you can see and believe in because you're smart and resourceful, whether or not you have a doctorate or an MD.